Have you ever picked up a bottle of Scotch, looked at the label and thought, okay, this looks impressive, but what does half of this actually mean? Single malt, blended malt, cask strength, natural color, non-chill filtered, matured in sherry cask, finish in port pipes, 46% ABV, 12 years old, no age statement. Much of this I have discussed in individual episodes, which you can find on my channel. So today I decided to tie it all together. It sounds simple until you realize a Scotch label is part information, part regulation, and part marketing. Now, I want to walk through how to actually read a Scotch label, simply as someone standing in a liquor store trying to figure out whether a bottle is worth buying or not. Welcome to Dram Straight Scotch 101. I'm Mike. Don't forget to like and subscribe below. Okay, let's start with the biggest thing on most Scotch labels. The name. Most of the time, the name on the front of the bottle is the distillery. So names like Macallan, Glenallachie, or Tamdhu, these are all distillery names that usually means that the whiskey was made at that distillery, but not always. Sometimes the names or the name on the bottle is the brand and not the distillery. So for instance, Johnnie Walker is a brand, Compass Box is a brand, Big Pete is also a brand. Those whiskeys may contain liquid from multiple distilleries, and the front label might not tell you every distillery involved. That does not automatically make it worse, it just means you need to understand what category you're looking at. And that brings us to one of the most important parts of the Scotch label, the category. If the label says single malt Scotch whiskey, that does not mean it came from one barrel or from one batch. It means it was made at one individual distillery, from malted barley, of course, using pot stills. That word single causes a lot of confusion. In single malt, single means single distillery. The bottle can still be made from different casks. In fact, most single malts, for instance, they're just all from different casks. A 12-year-old single malt might be a marriage of dozens or even hundreds of casks, but from the same distillery, blended together to create a consistent house design. So when you see single malt, think one distillery, malted barley, pot stills. Then there's single grain Scotch whiskey. This one confuses people too because single grain does not necessarily mean one type of grain. Again, the word single means one distillery. Grain whiskey can be made from grains such as wheat or corn or barley, usually using a different style of distillation. Is often lighter, softer, and more commonly used in blends. Then you've got your blended Scotch whiskey. This is probably the category most people know from brands like Johnnie Walker or Chivas Regal or Dewar's. A blended Scotch is a mix of one or more single malt whiskeys with one or more single grain Scotch whiskeys. That definition is set out in the Scotch whiskey regulations. Blends can be very approachable, and they are not automatically cheap or lower quality, but they are a different style than single malt. Then you've got blended malt Scotch whiskey. This means the bottle contains single malt Scotch from more than one distillery, but no grain whiskey. So if someone blends malt whiskey from Glenallachie, Benriach, and Glendronach, for example, that would be a blended malt. It is still all malt whiskey, but because it comes from more than one distillery, it cannot be called a single malt. So again, you have single malt whiskey from one distillery. Blended malt. The malt whiskey from multiple distilleries. Blended Scotch. Malt whiskey plus grain whiskey. Once you understand that, a Scotch label starts making a lot more sense. Now, let's talk about the age statement. If a Scotch label says 12 years old, 15 years old, or 18 years old, that number refers to the youngest whiskey in the bottle, not the average age, not the oldest cask, it's the youngest cask or the youngest in that particular bottle. So if a bottle says 12 years old, it may contain whiskey that is 12, 14, 18, or even older, but the youngest whiskey in the bottle must be at least 12 years old. The Scotch Whisky Association guidance explains that the only age that may state or be stated on the bottle is the youngest whiskey in the product. This is important because age can tell you something. It does not tell you everything, and again, this is something I had covered more in depth in a previous episode. A 12-year-old whiskey from excellent casks can be richer, deeper, and more enjoyable than an 18-year-old whiskey from tired old casks. Age matters, but cask quality matters way more. Distillery character also matters. ABV, the balance. So as previously mentioned here, do not fall into the trap of thinking older always means better. Older usually means more expensive. It does not always mean better. Now, what if the bottle has no age statement? That is called an NAS, or just no age statement whiskey. A no age statement Scotch still has to meet the legal minimum for Scotch whiskey. Scotch must be matured in oak casks for at least 3 years, and it must be bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV. So a no age statement bottle does not mean unaged. It just means the producer's not telling you the age of the youngest whiskey in the bottle. Sometimes NAS whiskey is used because the distillery wants flexibility. They might be using younger casks, older casks, different cask types, or creating a flavor profile where age is not the main selling point. But as a consumer, I always ask, if they're not giving me the age statement, what are they giving me instead? Are they giving me higher ABV, natural color, non-chill filtration, some kind of interesting cask maturation, a stronger flavor profile, or a better price? If the answer is yes, NAS can be great. If the answer is no, then sometimes you're paying for nice packaging and vague marketing. Now, let's talk about ABV, because this is one of the most useful parts of the label. ABV, as we've mentioned several times, is alcohol by volume. It tells you how strong the whiskey is. The legal minimum for Scotch, as mentioned before, is 40%. That's why you see so many bottles at exactly 40%. But many whiskey enthusiasts start paying closer attention when a bottle is reaching 46% or higher. Why? Because 46% often gives you more texture, more flavor delivery, and a fuller mouthfeel. It doesn't automatically mean the whiskey's better, but it often suggests the producer is trying to preserve more character. Then you might see 48% or 50, 52, 58, or even higher. At that point, you're definitely dealing with a higher strength whiskey, and it's probably a cask strength whiskey. Cask strength usually means the whiskey is being bottled at or near the strength that it came out of the cask at, without being watered down to the standard 40% bottling. These whiskeys can be powerful, intense, flavor-packed, but they can also be hot if the alcohol is not well integrated or in balance. So when you read the ABV, do not just think stronger equals better. Think, how much flavor and texture might this carry? And will I want to consider adding a few drops of water? At 43%, whiskey can be excellent. A 46% whiskey can be excellent. A 60% whiskey can be excellent. But they're all different experiences. Okay, let's talk about something I always look for: non-chill filtered. Chill filtration is a process some producers use to prevent whiskey from going cloudy when it gets cold or water's added. It makes the whiskey look clearer and more stable on a shelf or in a glass. I did a mini experiment on this a few episodes ago. Check it out in the links below. I've got it posted down there. Some whiskey drinkers believe chill filtration can remove some texture, oils, and the mouthfeel. I mean, I personally would agree with that statement, but it depends on, there's a lot of people that have different thoughts. So when a whiskey label says non-chill filtered, it usually means the whiskey's not gone through that filtering process. For many enthusiasts, that is a positive sign because it suggests that whiskey may have a richer mouthfeel and a more natural texture. That does not mean every chill filtered whiskey is bad. There are some excellent ones out there, but if I personally see 46% ABV, non-chill filtered, and natural color, I usually take that as a sign the producer is trying to present the whiskey in a more integrity-driven way. That brings me to natural color. Scotch whiskey is allowed to contain plain caramel coloring, often referred to as E150A. It's used to adjust or standardize color, not to make the whiskey taste like caramel. Some brands use it so they use it so that every batch looks consistent. Others avoid it and state natural color or non-color added on the label. Why does this matter? Because color can influence perception. If you see a very dark whiskey, you might assume that it's older, richer, and or heavily sherried. But color alone can be misleading if caramel coloring has been added. So if a bottle says natural color, that tells you the color is coming from the cask with no color added. Again, natural color does not automatically make the whiskey better, but it gives you more transparency. Okay, let's talk about cask information, because this is where labels can really get interesting and sometimes confusing as well. You might see terms like matured in ex-bourbon barrels, sherry cask matured, Oloroso sherry cask, Pedro Jimenez sherry cask, which is often referred to as PX for short, port finish, rum cask finish, virgin oak, first fill bourbon, refill sherry butts. This part of the label can give you clues about the flavor. Ex-bourbon casks often bring out vanilla, honey, coconut, orchard fruits, light spice, and oak. Sherry casks often bring out dried fruit, raisins, dates, figs, chocolate, spice, leather, and richer, darker notes. PX sherry casks tend to be sweeter and heavier. Think kind of like raisins, syrupy fruits, dark sugar, brown sugar, dessert-like richnesses. Oloroso sherry casks can be drier, nuttier, spicier, a little more structured. Port casks, they can bring red fruits, berries, jam, and sometimes wine-like sweetness. Rum casks can bring definitely tropical fruit, some bit of brown sugar and molasses as well, and some spice. Here's the key. Labels do not always tell you the full story. There's a big difference between a whiskey fully matured in sherry casks for 15 years and a whiskey that was mostly matured in bourbon casks and then finished in sherry casks for a short period. Both can be good, but they are not the same thing. So pay attention to the wording. If it says matured in, that usually suggests the whiskey spent its main aging period in that cask type. But if it says finished in, that usually means the whiskey was moved into that cask near the end of the maturation to add another layer of flavor. A finish can be excellent, but sometimes finishes are used to dress up a younger or less exciting whiskey. So again, you have to read the label carefully. Okay, let's talk about regions. On the bottle, you might see Highland, Speyside, Islay, Lowland, Campbelltown, or Island references. These can give you a rough idea of the style, but they're not hard rules. Islay often suggests peated or smoke, maritime notes, iodine, seaweed, or medicinal kind of characters. But not every Islay whiskey is heavily peated. Speyside typically suggests fruit, honey, sherry influence, and elegance, but Speyside distilleries can vary a lot. Highlands is a huge region, so it can include many different styles. Campbelltown typically has a funky, oily character. Lowland whiskeys are often lighter and more floral, but again, not always. Region is helpful, but it's not a guarantee. Okay, here's an example. Balvenie. It's a Speyside whiskey. They put out a peated Scotch called Week of Peat. So that's kind of breaking the rules a little bit. A peated Scotch from Speyside. All right, let's talk about independent bottlers. If the label says something like Signatory, Gordon and MacPhail, Douglas Lang, Cadenheads, or that Boutique Whiskey Company, you may be looking at an independent bottling. Independent bottling means the company on the label may not be the distillery. Independent bottlers buy casks from other distilleries, mature them, select them, and bottle them under their own label. These bottles can be amazing because they often show a different side of a distillery. You might get ABV, single cask releases, natural color, and non-chill filtration. But they can also be less consistent because each cask is different. Sometimes this can be a fun adventure. So with independent bottlers, you want to read the details carefully. Distillery, age, cask type, ABV, bottling date, number of bottles, what bottle number you have, and whether it's a single cask. Now, single cask is another phrase people love. A single cask whiskey means the bottle came from one individual cask, not a marriage of many casks, one cask. This is different from what I talked about earlier with single malt. And sometimes you've got shops that will buy an entire bottling from one cask. I've seen that before too, which is kind of cool. That can make it, the single cask, they definitely make it more unique, but unique doesn't automatically mean better. A single cask can be incredible. It can also be weird, funky, unbalanced, maybe too woody, too hot, narrow in flavor. I personally have not come across that so far yet, but it can happen. With a standard core range bottle, the blender can balance multiple casks together with a single cask. You get that cask exactly as it is. That's part of the fun though, and also part of the risk, I suppose. Now let's look at some of the smaller information on the labels. You may see a bottling date or a distillation date. If a whiskey says distilled in 2007 and bottled in 2024, you can work out roughly how long it matured. But remember, whiskey only ages in the cask. Once it's bottled, the maturation stops. A 12-year-old bottle that sat on the shelf for 10 years is not suddenly a 22-year-old whiskey. It's still a 12-year-old whiskey. You may also see a bottle count, like 1 of 600 bottles. That usually appears on limited releases or single cask bottlings. You might just see the cask number. You may see the bottle size as well. They're typically 700 millimeters in many markets, or 750 sometimes in other markets. I've seen 355, I've seen 500, but they're pretty rare. And of course, you may see tasting notes, but tasting notes are marketing. They're not the law. They can be helpful, but don't treat them like a guarantee. One person's dark chocolate and orange peel might be another person's oak spice and raisins. So, what should you actually look for when buying a bottle when you're standing in that aisle? Here's my quick label reading checklist. First, what category is it? Single malt, blended Scotch, or something else? Secondly, does it have an age statement? If yes, remember that the number is the youngest whiskey in the bottle. Third, what is the ABV? 40% might be fine, but 46% or even higher definitely is going to catch my attention. Fourth, does it say natural color? If yes, that gives you more confidence that the color is coming from the casks. Fifth, does it say non-chill filtered? If so, this often suggests better texture and less processing. 6, what casks were used? Bourbon, sherry, PX, Oloroso, port, rum, virgin oak. This gives you clues about what the flavor will be. And 7th, what is it fairly priced for what it gives you? I've done comparisons between a $290 bottle of Scotch versus an $800 bottle, where the $290 bottle was a clear winner, but the $800 bottle, it was all about marketing. So at the end of the day, the label is not just about information, it's about value. A good label is going to help you understand what you're buying. A weak label often hides behind vague language, fancy packaging, and romantic storytelling. So next time you pick up a bottle, do not just look at the age or the color. Read the whole label. Ask yourself, what is this bottle actually telling me? Is it telling me the distillery? Where is it from? The age, the ABV, the cask type, natural or not, fake color added, non-chill filtration? Or is it mostly telling me a story? Because once you know how to read a Scotch label, you become a much smarter buyer, something I wish I had known earlier in the game. You stop chasing only age, you stop assuming dark means better, you stop getting fooled by fancy boxes, and you start finding bottles that actually match your taste. And that's really the whole point. A Scotch label is not just decoration, it's a map you need to learn how to read. If you found this helpful, please hit like and subscribe below and follow along Dram Straight for more Scotch 101 episodes and honest whiskey talk. And as always, enjoy your whiskey, drink responsible, and drink it how you like it, and keep it dram straight. Cheers.